Awesome. So what we're basically going to cover today is we're going to do what we call a second level scrape. And we'll go in and look like a little bit deeper as to the how to scrape a second time, and we'll look at some scraping some pieces of information that might be a little bit harder to get info out of. And then we're also going to look at how do we interact with our user in the command line. And Anna, you just asked a great question. Let me go ahead and share it right now. I believe the video recording that I sent out, I believe that I made sure to put it in the description of that YouTube video, so it's easy to find. But let me share it out here, and then after this is over, I'll put it in the, why can't I think? I'll put it in the Slack. Yes, thank you. Perfect. So yeah, that's something that you can use as you're going to like make sure that whatever site you want to scrape is actually scrapable. So to get started today, as you can see, first things first, we have some different people here. And the first thing I want to do is like the point of making the scraper is that it's going to be flexible even when the website changes. Because if they're building their website correctly, they are using the same HTML and CSS selectors and like the same pattern every single time. And so I should, picking up where we left off yesterday, I should actually just be able to come over here and say Ruby bin, I think I called it stars, and we should be able to go ahead and get this running. And we'll see 5 different people today that have birthdays today. These stars have birthdays today. Perfect. It's still working. Harold Ramos gives us a little bit of a different thing. And so this is actually interesting. We could talk about how do you make it different if they actually give you different data. So for this person, it's not their birthday. It's when they were born and when they passed away. So we could make it a little bit more flexible so that this adjusts based on the information that we have here. A few things that I just kind of want to talk about in the get-go getting started here. We type in Ruby before we run bin stars every time. So we are specifying to our executable that we want to run this with Ruby. One thing that's a good thing to add as we kind of build this out a little bit better is what we call a shebang line. And what a shebang line does is it basically tells your bin file which programming language you're writing in. So all of this is Ruby code. We were telling it we were running Ruby the way we called the executable, but it's also really useful to include inside of your application that we are going to be running this in Ruby. And what that line looks like, I always have to look up the proper syntax of this because you only write it once and then you don't ever write it again, is we are basically going to be specifying that this environment and this bin file is in Ruby. Do I have that right? Yes, and I think this file might look a little bit different as we change it and use it now that I have that added. Yeah, there you go. It looks like it's commented out. It's not commented out. It's just this first line is telling it what language the rest of it is in. And notice it'll be a little bit more obvious on the video. You can go back and forth. These used to just all be black. Now my program knows this is Ruby and my text editor knows this is Ruby. And so it's brought in my standard Ruby coloring. And so I don't think I have the permissions to run it like this. I think I have to change those permissions, yeah. But it does, let me see if I can, that was the wrong command. I always have this problem where at the last minute I'm like, oh, let me do something different. And it's never a good idea because whenever I do that, we'll come back to it. I'll send it out to you guys on the I'll send it into you in the Slack. But basically there is a way to make it so that you don't have to write Ruby in front of here because we've now specified Ruby inside of our executable. And this is considered our executable because it's in our bin folder. What were you asking, Nelson?
Sorry, I'm eating. So after the shebang, like the user bin environment, is that where Ruby is, or is that where your like project is?
to be really honest, and this is probably bad because it's just the way my mind works, I've never thought about it that much. I've just always typed that in. User bin environment Ruby. I think it's specifying where my Ruby is living, but in a generic, no. I think it's specifying that the bin environment, like that any file in this bin environment is considered a Ruby file.
Got it.
That is a really good question, Nelson. And this is, so I really do have a tendency to like, I'm very much a how more than a why, which is sometimes bad, of like, oh, this works, let me use it. Let me not investigate the deep down, why was it written that way? So I'm gonna make a note of that and I will get back to you on it, Nelson. But good question. This should, if you just copy and paste this line, it should work. But yes, I think it would be useful to know in a little bit more detail which path it's specifying. A few other things that we can do that you'll see typically in your project, it starts to get a little bit messy as we require relative and we require in all these different places. So notice we have 3 require relatives here. We've been using Nokogiri and OpenURI, so those are listed in here. And I think we were also using a binding price, so we've listed the require there. It gets a little bit messy to do this. And so once we start building an application, one thing that we do with our file structure is we're gonna add an environment file. And so in our lib directory, I'm just gonna add a new file and we're gonna call it environment .rb. Environment. I always have to say it like that to be able to spell it correctly. So we'll have an environment file, and the whole point of this is going to be the file that basically requires everything else. And so in our stars, basically we'll take these and they will live in here. And any other place where we have a require, we will also take those and list them here. I believe there was one more, yeah. With the difference being, these are going to be requiring gems, and these are going to be requiring things relative to them. Is it, and this is one thing to think about, I know we kind of just talked about this for the first time yesterday, is it still necessary for me to do the 2 dots, go up to the lib, and come back down to get the CLI person and scraper? So you're right, Kizoto, it's not necessary anymore. It should still work because we're in the environment, we can always go up and come back in, but we are already inside of the lib. So we actually should be able to get rid of one level and just look for our CLI and our person and our scraper. And we would not want to go back up and look for it. I believe we would just want to, I get so turned around when I do environment files. They're just beside, I think we could just, we'll see it. If we break it, we break it and we'll fix it. That's always my attitude when I'm coding inside of here. And so in our stars file, when we do our require relative, instead of requiring this, we'll require the environment. And basically what this is saying is look at your environment file, require all of this stuff, and then continue on and start our CLI. I truly might have just broken it, so let's see. But if it breaks, we adjust, and then we keep moving. Yep. Okay, so I lib environment. So I do think I needed my dots I had before there. Although if it does dots, that brings it up to the lib file, which is too far up. Let's just do 1. There we go. Okay. Trial and error wins every time. So it needed the dot to be able to look at the other ones, but not the double dots. I do believe if we exited it out, I think this will still work. It just is not actually necessary anymore because we're already inside the lib folder. But it still should work theoretically. Yeah. So you could do it either way. Everything we just covered is really just more dealing with like setup in your environment files. As you guys get started on your project, if you have any questions about those, that part I know can seem a little overwhelming. Please don't hesitate to reach out to just kind of understand how is everything talking to each other. So to recap right now, when we start our program, we basically say, go to the environment file and require all of these pieces. This is a really nice way to do it because anytime we want to add any other gems or any other files, we will have one stop shop that we add those things. We don't have to add it in multiple files. And so this is just like a way to organize your application. From here, we're now ready to actually add a little bit more to our project. So at the moment, this is like pretty boring. All it does is it starts and it says these stars have birthdays today. It would be pretty nice if we could add to this, like, which star would you like to see their bio? Or something like that, where we could grab a little bit more information and actually go take a look at a specific star. So that is something where we're going to be interacting with the command line. And because it's something that we're going to be interacting with the command line, I'm going to go add code to my command line interface. And so just where we have everything else in our command line, our starting it and our display stars, we would now do our prompts, or we would ask questions inside of our CLI. How would I just kind of like starting this, if I am asking the user to tell me which star they want to learn more about, give me some help here about how might I start thinking about doing that. So what we want to do is we basically want to prompt the user to choose a star. And then we want to accept their input. And then finally, we probably want to make sure and check that their input is valid. It kind of goes back to that tic-tac-toe lab if any of you guys are stuck on that. So how would I start just simply prompting the user to choose a star? This is the easy one, hopefully. Yeah, so Courtney, that one is actually, and maybe that this is a little bit confusing, the get chomp is going to be a little bit more for accepting their input. But that is probably what we would want down here, is we would want to say like, okay, our user chose something, and gets chomp will allow them to type in. So maybe by saying prompt, that actually was a little bit confusing. But yeah, this one's just going to tell the user. And so we will do an output, and we might say something like choose a number to learn more about a star. And we can see that these are the numbers 1 through 5. There could potentially be a day that not a lot of people are born, and maybe they only have like 3 stars showing. It's possible. You never know. So we could say something like choose a number between 1 and 5 to learn more about a star. What would be a more flexible way to write this in case they sometimes had 4 stars or 3 stars showing instead? How could we get this number 5 from info we already have? Yeah, so let's look and let's see how many people we have. And one way to do that would be to look at all of our people. And so I would interpolate here, and I would say person.all.size. If you know that it's always going to be 5, it's fine to put that in. But I know for a fact a lot of you guys are going to be dealing with sites where you might have variable numbers. And so it's useful to know you can always look at, remember, this is how many people I scraped. And so this is a way to say we're choosing a number between 1 and however many people show up. So if we run this again, it should get a little bit further. and choose a number between 1 to 5 to learn more about a star, and it will allow us to put in a number. So I'll hit the number 5, and then it ends. By default, this will end every time it just gets to the end of the program. So unless we've told it not to end, it's gonna exit your program. So we probably want to do a few other things in here. The next piece being check to make sure that their input is valid. So what would be an invalid input? Yeah, anything from 6, 0, 100, A, B, C, D, E, like anything like that would be an invalid input. So we would want to make sure that their input, we could write a different method for this. I think sometimes it's useful to, you know, what am I trying to say? I think it is useful to keep your code in small little bits of different methods. So we would want to check to make sure that their input is a number between 1 and 5. So could I do something just like input dot between 1 and 5? Would that work for every situation? Taylor says no. Which situation would it not work for?
Like if you had a 6.
So this would it return false if they had a 6?
I don't know, but I think you want to use that person all size here so that it would be based off of like how many people you had.
Gotcha. That's a good call. We want to make sure that this is flexible. Is this inclusive? We'll see in a second. If it is inclusive, we can like check. Actually, let's just put in a binding pry. So after the input, we'll put in a pry and we'll call our method. So we'll see what happens. Because I think it's a little bit hard to just theoretically talk about what's going to happen when we hit that pry. My program was a little faster. Okay, so choose more about a number. Let's put in a number that shouldn't work. So I'll put in a 6. And now let's see what happens if I call valid input. And we'll pass in the variable input. Because my pry stopped here, it means I have access to any variables above my binding pry. It also means I have access to any other methods inside this program. Valid input, comparison of string with 1 failed. What would be a solution if you saw that error in your own code? What is that error telling you? Remember, anytime we get an input, even if they give us a number, input is going to be a string. So if we look at the class of input, it's a string, even though it's a number, it's going to be a string number. So we would want to add in here, we would need to somehow change this to an integer. It depends where you want to change it to an integer. Some people want to change it if they know that every expected choice is going to be a number. They might just change it at the beginning. That's up to you. There's going to be like the nice thing about your project, and sometimes the intimidating thing is you don't have a test telling you you must change it here. You get to make those decisions. So we might say they can only ever put in a number. So let's go ahead and make it a 2i here. What happens with 2i if they had typed in something like ABC? Does anyone know what this gives us if we try to turn it into an integer? So actually, and this is kind of lucky because it makes our life 1,000 times easier. No matter what I put in here as a string, if it's not a number, it's going to always give us 0, which is super helpful if you think about it, because we want to make sure our number's between 1 and the person.allSize. And so by default, 0 is going to be out of that input, like that is acceptable. Now let's just make sure, one thing I like to check is this inclusive? That was a question that Courtney asked, and it was a really good question. So let's see if it includes, if 5 is considered between 1 and the personnel size. It is. Let's make sure that 1 is, and then let's make sure that 6 is not. Perfect, and that 0 is not. Perfect. So it does look like it's inclusive, and between is going to include the 1 and include the 5. This is very similar to writing out, is the input less than or equal to 5, and is the input greater than and equal or equal to 0, or 1, sorry, not 0. And so that's basically what we're saying here when we write this comparison. Cool. So we've made it a little bit further. We can now use what we had typed in. We can say, okay, let's check to see if this is a valid input. And then we'll pass in our input, which is already turned into an integer. And we removed all the white space with our chop. From here, we're going to want to make some sort of decision. So if it's a valid input, we'll want to do something. For now, let's just print out nice choice. What might we want to do if they didn't type in a valid input?
Not so nice.
Not so nice, yeah. Yeah, we could definitely print something out that says like not a valid choice. But what else might we need to do? Oh, I see some people in the chat. So yeah, we would maybe want to tell them like try again, suggest what to put in the range, like 1 through 5 is acceptable, not a valid choice, choose 1 through 5. Spelling is not my strong point. But we also want to make sure that we're re-asking for their choice. So like 100%, we should give them some sort of error message, but it's also really important that we're re-asking for their input. And so Kevin, you've hit the nail on the head. We would need some sort of loop. So we would need some sort of situation where we say like, until a valid input, make sure we're asking for a valid input, and then we could continue on with our program. So there's really 2 ways to handle this. And I'll go ahead and tell you, like, it seems like we have a lot of code here. And whenever you get to a point in your run method that you've really written a lot of code, that's a time to think this should probably be its own method. And so I'm going to actually turn this into its own method, and we'll make what we're about to do a little bit easier. So we'll say ask for star choice, maybe. I don't know. You can name your methods whatever you want them to be. It is always better to name them something that will actually tell you information about what's happening. So we'll just move this code down here. And now we kind of have 2 options here for a loop. So one thing we could do is we could say not a valid choice, and very similar to tic-tac-toe, we could use recursion and we could start this method over again. So we could actually call ask for star choice again. And so the way this would run is our run method, and it would be useful if I actually called this method, is going to say welcome. It's going to scrape our stars, display the stars, and then ask for our choice. It will tell us choose this number, grab our input. If it's a good input, say nice choice. Otherwise, it will start back up at the top here. So in a way, we have created a loop. And this should work, and it should continue to ask for our input until we give a valid input. And so let's just try it. And then we'll try another situation as well. It is normal for this to take a little while. It's because it's scraping every time, and it does take a bit of time for your computer to scrape. So let's choose something that's not a valid choice. Perfect, it's asking for us for another one. 7 is not a valid choice. 6, how about -2? So this is working out really well. And then if I do choose something that's a valid choice, it ends up saying nice choice and ending. This is one way to do it. And this is what we call recursion, because you're calling the method itself. It's sometimes like, I would say be careful with this, because sometimes it gets a little bit hard to figure out like where you are in the loop. So just be really careful as you're programming to keep track of what's happening at every point. There is another way to write this, and I do think it's useful to show you both options. So I'm going to go ahead and comment this out. Not delete it. Our other option could be, we could say something like, until they give you a valid input, we could ask for, we could basically print out that's not a valid choice, and we could ask again for their input. It is really important in this format when we use an until loop. There's a few things that are really important, and one is that this variable is going to stay the same name. It's going to have the same name as we continue to go, because we want this until loop, we want that variable name to change. And then we would end our loop, and after it ends, that means that they do have a good choice, and so we would say nice choice. So the logic is, it would continue this circle until they gave you a number 1 through 5. As soon as they do give you a number 1 through 5, it would end and we would put nice choice. So let's run it, make sure I'm not lying to you. Let's make sure both of these work. Okay, so again, we type in playing random, looks good. -1. And then let's make sure it works when we give a great one. It is your choice how you want to deal with your loops. Both of these are very acceptable ways, and just kind of, I would say, choose which works, choose which makes the most sense in your mind. Any questions about the difference between those two or how they're working? Okay, well, we'll keep going. So now that we have this nice choice, now that we've chosen what we need, what might we want to do next? So after I chose 4, it just exits. That's a little lame. What would we expect or hope for it to do next? We've got no thoughts here. Yeah, you guys don't have to know the code to do it. I just want to know, like, realistically, you're going to be programming your thing, so you get to think about, like, okay, what should the next thing it does? So the next thing it should do is we should get some more information about these stars. So, like, we chose star 4, so we need to drill in on star 4 and grab more information about that star. There's probably going to be a lot of code that goes into this, and whenever there's something that's going to be a lot of code, usually that means that we're going to need another method. So after they put a nice choice, maybe we will scrape and display star info. We will want to scrape and display star info for a specific celeb. So it'll be pretty important that we pass around that input that now at the moment is in this last example was representing 4. So we would want to make sure that that information, we save it and we continue on. If you are coding and you aren't sure when to make methods, again, this is very different than a lab where they tell you, make this method and this method and this method. What I would say, it's okay to kind of code everything in one method and then go back to it and refactor and say, this is all doing the same thing, like this is all the same purpose. Right here, all of this is looking for a valid input. That should be one method. All of this is doing the same thing. That should be one method. So it is okay to go back and refactor after if you aren't sure where to make new methods. I've done this before, so it's a little bit easier for me to predict where new methods should be made. So we're going to need a new method. And basically, the point of this method is we are going to grab more information about whoever we chose. So in this case, we chose number 4. So if we click on this person, we should be able to then grab more information about them. Notice we do have to go to a different site. Like, we actually need to get more specific. In your situation, you might not need to go to another site. It could be that you have more detailed information on that page, but where we were just looking, there truly wasn't more detailed information, whereas my people. Here we go. So we will need to grab this link. And one thing is we will need to have grabbed this link when we initially grabbed their name and their age. So our first task is to go back, and when we were scraping and when we were grabbing both their name and their age, it's going to be really important that we also grab their URL. So they have their own unique URL, and so we need to figure out what was their URL. I'm going to put a binding pry in here so we can maybe figure out and see. It could be that it's not in this section. I don't know. So we'll go ahead and run it and get stuck in that pry. And this is another spot where I would inspect the page and see if we can try to predict how am I going to get that URL. So all of these should be the same. It doesn't really matter which one I click on. And the piece of info that I need for this one is actually going to be this href. So I know it looks a little bit crazy, but that is the link that we're going to want to grab. So let's take a look as to what was in the section. And this is going to be a lot to scroll through. It does look like, and I know it gets cut off, and this helps too that I know what I'm like looking for. If you can dodge a rock, yeah. I love that movie. So, but we have our value here, and that looks really similar to the start of this link. So I believe that this piece is going to give us the link. It looks like we do have an A tag, and an A tag are our links. So it looks like we do have hope of actually grabbing our link out of here. Remember, we are in this section. So the section is this whole set of HTML, and we just want to grab the link. So if I just want to grab the link, I can use my .css selector, and you can either type in classes, IDs, or HTML elements. My A tag doesn't have a class and it doesn't have an ID. So I'm just going to type in A to be A tag, and we should get some more specific information back. This looks like it's just grabbing our element. Now the tricky part about A tags is in the past we've been able to do .text. We can't do .text here because .text isn't going to give us any of the data inside of an element. It's going to only give us the stuff that gets displayed to the user. And when we think about links, a lot of times for links, we don't see the text of the link. Like we don't see the HTML www. We just see some fancier, prettier text. And so we've got some great suggestions in the chat, and I really like it. What we need to grab is this element here, or this attribute, sorry, the href. And so we're going to try what Nethelbert has, and we'll see what we get back. So this is a common error that most people are going to run into. Even though it looks like we should just, out of this thing, we should just go ahead and we should be able to grab the href. The way Nokogiri is set up, when we need to grab attributes of a link, there's a little bit more work that we need to do. And I'm trying to think of the best way to describe how we need to get there. So one thing that you can see is that when we just said A, our output value looks like it's coming out in an array, right? It looks like that. And so what happens if I just grab the very first part of the array? We actually then are going to get our link element. And this is very normal. And this is a built-in part of Nokogiri. And this will save you a lot of time in scraping if you can kind of wrap your head around it. When we scrape and we say A, what we're telling Nokogiri to do is to grab every single A tag element. So the expected output is an array of many A tags. We have already zeroed down and we've already drilled down on like, we only are looking at this one small subset of HTML. So we will only get one A tag back. But the way in general that Nokogiri works is it's going to look for every single A tag and spit it back out to you in something that's iterable. Very similar to how we were getting an array of stars here. And it basically grabbed every single instance where we had a div of widget caption and caption below, and then a div with a class primary. So in general .css, the return value is always an array. If you know that there's only one thing in the array and it is the thing you need, you can always do the bracket 0. The reason we didn't need the bracket 0 before is because the way .text works, it works on a single HTML element, or it works on an array. So we could still call .text right here, but we could also call .text before it's an array. And the difference is if we call .text before it's an array, we get the text of every single thing. So like if you kind of looked back on the first video yesterday, or think back to when we were initially using the REPL like scraper tester, we were getting all of the actors' information, or all of the actors' stars' names when I did .text. So .text is basically able to, even though it's an array, just grab all of the text values and return it and ignore the fact that it's an array. But when we want to dive down more specifically to a single attribute, you're going to want to specify that we are going to just be looking at one piece. So now we'll try doing href and see what we get. And that looks like it is it. It unfortunately is not the prettiest URL because we don't have a www in front of it, but that is our value that we will get out of there. Another way I believe you can access this, I think you can call like .attributes and get to it that way as well, like .attributes. Let's try .value. Nope. Attributes, that is an href pointing to a value. So I think we would still have to do href here. And that part, then we would need the value out of here. So that's our longer, more convoluted way to get there. Nathelbert's suggestion is the much better way of getting there because we get the same result back. But it is important just to notice that you did need that bracket 0. Emphasize that because I know that it causes confusion later on. Could anyone potentially re-explain to the group why did I write it this way when I was trying to grab our URL? So if I said URL equals, in this situation, that would be our URL. Why do I have to do the bracket 0 here?
Doesn't grab the entire A tag.
Yeah, so it can grab the entire A tag, and so that we don't have more than one A tag that we're trying to grab an href from. Yeah, basically because the output is always going to be an array. So this is our URL that we've grabbed here, and so we would want to pass in one more argument to our new person that we make. If we're going to give our person one new argument, what changes would I need to make to the person class? Yes, Lucy, you're correct. The output is like an array of, and actually you can kind of, it's like an array of hashes or an array of like node modules is kind of what they're considered. But yes, it's like an array of hashes. So if we found this new URL and we want to pass this new URL to our person, just like we're passing the name and the age. Actually, I'm going to write this so it looks a little bit easier to read. Here we go. If we're going to add this here to the URL, Nathelbert, you are correct. We would need to make sure that we add this as another attribute. and likewise that we are also using this on initialization. If you get to metaprogramming, which I feel like some of you guys are there are easier ways to get this done with the send method. I'm going to go ahead and encourage you, do not use the send method if you do not understand what it's doing. There's nothing wrong with doing it this way. If you want to understand the send method in more in depth, I have done a previous lecture that I know I shared out at one point, and I can share it again. But you're going to get to the final section, and there's a lot of videos that can help you along the way. And a lot of those videos are going to use the send method. And I just want to emphasize, if you use the send method, you are going to be asked about it in your final review and asked to explain what it does. So if you don't know what it does, please do not use it. And in general, with any piece of your code, you will always be asked, why did you do that? And so it's important that you can explain what each line of your code is doing. So this looks like it should work. We should have a URL for our person. Yeah, there are other ways you can do mass assignment. You don't necessarily have to do the send method. You are correct. Like I saw Nelson had done a cool thing with like the instance. It was like, it was a method I hadn't seen a lot before, but it was like set instance variables. And he just took all the keys and set the instance variables. So there are more than one way of doing it, but just whatever you do, just make sure you understand it is the main takeaway. Oh, that didn't work. Well, you know, it's good to try new things. So, okay, cool. So now we have this set up where we now have a URL. Now that we have a URL, we can actually deal with what we were originally going to deal with. So the idea being, once I choose a number, and I'm going to go ahead and exit out of this, we want to end up going to this HTML or this URL web address. Clearly, also, this is not a URL web address. This is just the end piece. So like, for example, if I put this here, we should get to, I think that was Jenna Malone. So it will take us there, but it also needs to take us there with the .imdb. So it is important to realize what you're putting into your information. So this section was just the name. How can I update this so it actually also included our site part at the beginning? So what we really want to be doing basically is we want it to look like the full thing, but we have them separately. Yeah, so we can just use some interpolation. We could also use concatenation, which is where we just add them together. So this represents my name / and then that unique ID. We actually can, I know it looks a little bit funny, but you can just do site plus, with the only issue potentially being, I think both of these might have a slash there. But I don't think I need this initial slash. So I believe that should do it. Like we can actually just write it as site, which is our HTTPS www.imbd.com plus what our end tag is to get a full URL. Okay, so from here, we've been doing a lot. We got to kind of like bring this all home. So from here, what we want to finally do is we know like our input was 4, right? And we want to take that input, or if it was 1, 2, whatever it was, and we want to make sure that we're going to that person's URL. So what kind of just pseudocode, and I would say pseudocode in all of this is really useful. We want to find the person that corresponds with the input. So if it was the first person, you know, and they put in 1, we want to find that first person. We also then want to scrape more info about that person, and then we would want to display that info. So to deal with this first one, finding the person that corresponds with the input. So if our input was number 4, or whatever it was, is there a way, just looking at person.all, that we could grab that fourth person? Yeah, so Nathelber, you added in, and Lucy, you did as well. I appreciate it. That our input is going to be off one, very similar to your tic-tac-toe. It's going to be off one because remember, they type in normal numbers 1 through 5, and arrays have indexes of 0 through 4. So person number 4, if we're trying to access them using an array index, is really array index 3. And so we would want to do something that looks like this. And that would be finding our person. So I'm going to say person. Notice I do it lowercase because any variables that store information that we create need to be lowercase. So this is the person that we just found based on who our user chose. And then we would want to scrape more info about this person. If we're talking about scraping, it's going to be something in our scraper class. And so we would need to call our scraper class. I think we've called it scraper. And I might say scrape details. Again, you make up these method names as you go. You can call it whatever you want, but I'm going to just call it scrape details. And then I'm going to send in information about who is the person I want to scrape. The reason I'm sending this person to there is that person knows what their URL is. And theirs is a unique URL that's different than everyone else's. When I send this person in, I am sending the full object in, so that in the scraper class, I can access any attributes about that person that I want to. And so then I would go over to the scraper class, and we are gonna make a new method. And looking at where my ends are, we can do scrape details, and this is gonna be a person object. I might even rename it over here because our names don't have to be the same from one side to the other. And we're gonna follow the same pattern. So anytime we scrape, we're gonna wanna open the site. So we can start kind of with that. Then we're going to want to basically turn that into a parsable Nokogiri doc. In this case, what would my site be? How would I access that URL that we just set a second ago? And I know a lot of you guys like to write in the chat. I'm very okay with you unmuting yourself as well.
Is it the person object.site or .url?
Uh-huh. So this is just an object, which means it has all of its attributes. So we can access its URL attribute. And this should be this URL that we set up here earlier, hopefully, if we've done things correctly. And then from there, we can do what we did previously, and we can grab some more info about this person. So let's put a binding pry here, and we'll just stop there and make sure that we can get to this part in our code. I thought I hadn't exited that. And so this is gonna go through a lot of steps to get here. And to be honest, we coded a little bit more than I like to before just testing things. I'm a little bit of a bigger fan of testing as we go. Let's put in the number 1. And this is the problem. We've got some debuggers on our team. What does this method, I told you the most common method that common error that people run into. What is this error telling me? Undefined method, yes. What is my undefined method? It says, and so this is kind of tricky. In the scrape and display star info, we tried to call scrape details for the scraper class. And so the no method error, the undefined method is actually scrape details. But you might say, well, look, you have scrape details on line 20. It's saying undefined method scrape details. And remember, the second part of this is the most important for the scraper class. I accidentally made this an instance method, and it needs to be defined as a class method. So these are the errors that can drive you crazy because you look at it and you go, I have that method. What is it talking about? It's undefined. Double check, what is it undefined for? It's undefined for a class, It is defined for an instance, but we called it as a class. You'll get used to seeing those, and at some point it'll like spark why it doesn't work. Awesome. So we are in our binding pry. This is good news. Things have worked so far. I just want to check to make sure that our URL came out correctly. Looks like it did. Okay, that looks good. And then we should have a doc that basically is going to have all of the information on this page. And just for like sake of time, let's just grab some basic info from here. Let's grab maybe the bio. We don't need the full bio. We can just do this standard bio that we see here. And very similar to what I suggested. Oh, this bio is going to be a little bit annoying because it's going to try to grab our A tag too. Well, we'll see what we get when we grab it. Like I said to do last time, I always right click here and I copy our selector. And then I would come back, and this one's gonna be a little bit different than last time because we're specifically dealing with only one person. So our hope would be that this information doesn't repeat as much as it did last time. We'll see. And so if I wanted to select this, I'm basically gonna follow the order that they told me. So they have a ID called name bio text, and then they have two classes underneath it. And so if I wanted to grab this with my .css, it would look a little bit like .css. I could use this hashtag one in here. And then I might say that needs the T, a space. Anytime you see these arrows, just give a space and then another space. If you wanted to be even more specific, you can see this div has a class of inline. So I could say inline here or something of that nature. And then to make sure it works, let's test it. So let's see if that grabs the right information. It looks like it does. Notice this is an array of hashes, but because we just care about the text and we don't care about the specific attributes, we can do .text. We do get this other extra stuff in here. That's something that you have done a lot of labs that talk about removing specific stuff. What would be one way that I could make this look a little bit cleaner? What if I just simply start with .strip? It didn't do a lot, but it did get rid of these like these ends and extra spaces, which is a good place to start. I agree, we could use regex, but I try to stay away from that. Do you guys remember last time, what did we do if we wanted to get rid of some, there's a few different ways of doing this really. But truly, anytime, I kind of want it to just, what do I want it to remove? Probably I want it to remove see full bio because I think that's gonna pop up on all of these and I don't want them to see the full bio. So yeah, I could do some sort of G sub. And I could be G subbing for the ... or I could G sub for like this see full bio. So I could do something like see full bio, and we'll just substitute it with nothing. And now it should be a little bit simpler. I could even add another .strip on the end. Oh, I thought it would get rid of that extra space. What is there in here? This thing we want to get rid of too. See full bio.
Is there any way to arrange from like that white space to like -1 maybe or something like that? Right after the ...
Yes, there probably could be. Well, I mean, we could split too. Like that would be a possibility, like even to split on the ... And that would clear out all the other half of our information. Split actually might be a good idea because it could be that like they always say ... They might not always say see full bio. This is something where I would probably start with this code. And then if I notice that some of them came out to be weird, like some of them didn't say see full bio, then I might adjust what I was doing. I don't know if you could just say grab that white space to the end. You got, because I feel like the white space is too generic, like we have too many other spaces in here. But honestly, Nelson, when you're doing it, like I would just play around, because there are a lot of different ways to get the same thing done. I'm really comfortable using GSub, so I tend to use that instead. But there's like a whole bunch of different ways of always like accomplishing the same thing. So, and this would be your bio. And we could add a whole bunch of attributes in here. So we might also want to just grab like that she was, we already know when they were born. So maybe instead we're trying to grab their birthplace, which this one actually would be a bit hard because we would get all of this info. And so you have to decide what you want and how you want to deal with it. But we could also grab this portion as well. So let's just say, actually, if we wanted the third one, we could do that as well. So we'll copy our selector, and then I'll do doc.css. And I'll start with, anytime you have an ID, it's a good thing to start with because it's going to be more specific. We want an A tag. This one, we really want the third A tag, not just any A tag. And I believe that this is going to give us all three of them. Yeah, so we could specifically, maybe we do .last.text if we want to grab just the last A tag. So there are different ways where you can finagle it, because remember .css always returns an array. So we would add this in here, and I just realized what time it is, so we will wrap this up. But I want to show you how you can deal with this. So remember how we brought in a person object here? Because we brought in a person object, we have access to every single person object instance method. So if I add an instance method for location, and I add like a setter and a getter method for location, and I add a setter and getter method for bio, inside of here, I can just say person object dot bio equals, and I can say person object dot, well, it would help if that matches city equals, and because these are setter and getter methods that I have defined in my person class, and because I passed in a full person object, this is going to be updating that individual person. So we will now have details about that person that back in the CLI class, as soon as this scrape has happened, we can put out and we can print out person.bio. And we can print out, puts out born in person.city. And we would maybe want to make this a little bit neater and put some spaces in there. But at the end of the day, I just forget which way they need to go. But at the end of the day, this would get the job done. So we'll do a final test. Let me make sure I got rid of my binding pry. And then as I'm kind of doing this final test, what lingering questions do you guys have? So we should be able to choose any of these. And we'll see, we come out with their bio and we come out with where they were born pretty easily and pretty simply, just because we were able to take advantage of our object orientation, where we now have assigned an attribute to this object. Now back in the CLI class, that person knows about that attribute, and we're able to send that attribute out to our text. Obviously, this ended at the end. We might not want it to end. That's why we separate these into different methods, so that we could send it back to ask for star choice, or you could send it somewhere else so that it continues. Maybe you could send it to a main menu asking them what they want to do. Any last questions before we end? I will add, when you do get to your project, I just want to show this to you guys. I have it pulled up. Like I mentioned last time, I would encourage you to work locally. If you are not working locally, or even if you are, there is a video basically walking you through the GitHub steps of starting your project. And so this video here, this is just on your actual project page, is a really good resource if you're having trouble just getting started and knowing how to connect it to GitHub. because I know that's one part we didn't really fully go over today. But it would be very similar to any time you might have cloned or submitted a lab manually. So like those steps for that one array lab that wasn't working, it would be very similar to that. So like now that I'm done, I would commit all of this, and I would probably hopefully commit it in smaller steps, but for your sake, I'm doing it in part 1 and part 2, and then I would push this to my origin master. Yeah, so Nathalbert, it's up to you. You could at the end of that, you could have said like, where were we displaying the info? You could have basically said, do you want to like hit enter to continue, any other key to exit, or something like that. You could have given them some instruction of if they wanted to go back to the menu, what to do. What's the due date for the project? Good question. So we have next week off. Then the next week, we're going to be spending that full week working on the project. Chris and myself will be very available to help you guys. Instead of actually doing one-on-one meetings that week, we will be doing tons of open office hours plus 30-minute bookable spots for the second half of the week. And the reason for that is purely because if your one-on-one is in the beginning of the week and you haven't really started your project, you're kind of in trouble for when it gets to the end of the week. And now all of a sudden you need help on your project, but Chris and I are in one-on-ones and we can't assist you. So end of the story, basically due date is at the end of that week that we come back, which would be date-wise December 8th. So long way of answering that question, I'm on it. Awesome. Well, I will let you guys go. I know you all have places you need to be. If you have any other questions, just put them in the Slack channel or reach out to Chris or myself directly. Thanks, guys.